Good morning, friends. So today in this video we will be discussing hemophilia. Hemophilia. Now we are basically discussing the monogenetic disorders and all those different kind of genetic disorders, right, which are rare, but if one is affected, it is very difficult to be treated. So when we talk of your hemophilia, you know that hemophilia is your common hereditary, it is your common hereditary coagulation blood disorder. Coagulation blood disorder. Okay. And so this is a coagulation blood disorder. So basically there is a problem in coagulation of the blood, right? And that is because of the deficiency of two important clotting factors like clotting factor 8 and clotting factor 9. So this is basically a disorder in which the clotting factors come into play, and if there is a problem in the clotting factor, okay, reduced activity of the clotting factor, and that is basically being linked with the coagulation of the blood, and so it is a bleeding disorder. And since it is a hereditary disorder, so we need to know the pattern of inheritance, and the pattern of inheritance of this disease is your X-linked inheritance. So you know that this particular disease is associated with your X chromosome, right? So X chromosome, so hemophilia is a bleeding disorder that slows down the blood clotting process. Now, one of the very important factor which we all need to know, that is it is transmitted via female, right? So female is the one who is transmitting it, and who is getting affected? The male. So the male is getting affected, so it is the male who suffers, right? So the transmitters are your female, whereas the sufferers are your male. So female who carry a single mutated gene. So now you know that since it is an X-linked disorder, so you have 2X. So when you have 2X, so you know if one X is mutated, right, there is another X to function properly. So what will happen? Of course, that individual will be asymptomatic, but the individual will be a carrier. So the individual will be asymptomatic, but the individual will be a carrier. So people who have hemophilia often have longer bleeding after some sort of contact or your injury. So people who have severe hemophilia starts to have spontaneous bleeding in the joints and muscles all around their body. So hemophilia is more common in males and than in females. So you understand that it's a bleeding disorder, and you know that depending upon the severity of the disease, you have different severity of bleeding. And so hemophilia, and moreover from the genetics of the hemophilia, we know that hemophilia is more common in your males than in females. Next, we will move on to the history. So we will move on to the history of your hemophilia. So if you move on to the history, you know that it goes back to 2nd century AD. 2nd century AD, when this particular disease actually came into being. And moreover, you know that originally this is being coined by the individual Sconlin. So it is Sconlin who has actually coined the term hemophilia, and in the year of 1820s. Okay. Originally, the term hemophilia, okay, the term was your hemorrhaphilia. Hemorrhaphilia. And what does it mean? It means love for hemorrhages. So it is your love for hemorrhages. Okay. But over time, it actually became your hemophilia. So people started calling it hemophilia. And you know, this hemophilia is the disease of royal family. It is being called as the disease of kings. Why? Because it was carried by many members of Europe's royal family, Queen Victoria I of England. And this Queen Victoria I of England was the carrier of your hemophilia. So next we will move on to the inheritance pattern of your hemophilia. So when we move on to the inheritance pattern of your hemophilia, so let's first clear out the board. Hemophilia A and hemophilia B, you know, hemophilia A and hemophilia B are basically your X-linked recessive pattern, and the genes are basically associated with X chromosome. So they are basically associated with your X chromosome. Now, when we are talking of this X chromosome, we have to take both male and female into account. So if you take your male and female into account, now your male has one X chromosome, so it is XY, and your female have two X chromosomes. So it is very important that if this particular one X, only one X, which is being mutated, then of course the male will be affected. But if your female have one X mutated, you know that there is another X which can support, right? And so they are the carrier. They are called as the carrier, but they are asymptomatic. Am I clear or not? So now the question is about the carrier female. So do they show any type of phenotype? Now you know that most of the female, right, usually have half the usual amount of clotting factor. So they have half the usual amount of your clotting factor. So that means what? That means what? They have reduced clotting factor, but that is enough for clotting. So that is why they don't understand that they are the carrier. But however, there are 10% carriers, 10% women who have less than half clotting factor. And those who have less than half clotting factor, right, they are prone to unusual bleeding, right? So then that individual comes to know, yes, the individual is having the bleeding disorder. Next, we will move on to the inheritance pattern or the total genetics of hemophilia. So let's see, this is your father's gene and this is your mom's or mother's gene. So your father is having one affected X and one normal Y, whereas your mother is having X and X. So now if you draw the Punnett square, you get to see that your father, you have 4 offsprings and one is having XX, XX, XY and XY. So here you get to see that 50% of the offspring is a carrier. And this 50% offsprings are basically your female. And since that female is having one normal X, so they are the carrier. Now I will move on to the next case. So in the next case, what is happening is that father, this is a father and this is a mother. Now this father is without hemophilia, so XY, normal XY, and your mother is X and Y, so your mother is a carrier, right? So what will happen? So if you get to see, that this is, you will have a normal XY, so if you do the crossing, you will have normal X, Y, right? Then you will have X and carrier, right? Then you have an affected individual, and I'm very sorry, here I have put your Y, it will be X, so it is your XX, this is your XX, XY, then this particular one with the XY, the son and the daughter. So you have 50% normal, right? And 25% affected and 25% carrier. Affected and 25% carrier. So 50% normal. Why? Because out of the 4 offspring, you have 2 offsprings, one male, another female, which is your normal. Now out of the 4, you have one, that is the son, which is your affected. Okay, and out of the 4, 25%, this woman, that child, which is a girl child, is actually a carrier, right? So this is one sort of your inheritance. Next, again we will do another inheritance. So let's do over here. So it is your father, which is your affected. So it is your father which is affected into your mother, which is normal. So what you get? You get X, then X, then XY. This is your XY, right? And XY. So here you get to see that all the sons are normal, whereas all the daughters are your carrier. So this is another option. This is another probability of your cross. Okay. Next, a bit of theoretical aspect. If it is hemophilia A, the factor which is being deficient is factor 8. Blood clotting factor 8 is deficient. Hemophilia B, it is your factor 9 which is deficient. Hemophilia C, which is your factor 11. And hemophilia, parahemophilia, which is your factor 5. So for today's class, we end over here. So we will continue our class where we will be discussing every hemophilia A, B, C and parahemophilia in details. So for any question and query, please comment on Google Classroom.